Hi, today I'm going to be discussing Midnight Tides, Book 5 in Malazan Book of the Fallen by Erikson. This book was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed my experience reading this book. There were so many amazing moments of horror and humor, fantastic characters, excellent dialogue, gruesome moments, horrific moments. In fact, after I finished this book, I was asked what my favorite moments were, and it was so hard to come up with just one or two. There were several moments that were fantastic or that just really gripped me in this book. One of those being the prologue itself with Siltus Ruin and Scabandari Bloodeye setting the tone for the book. I also loved the Sword Quest journey and Rulod awakening from the dead after his corpse is being prepared with the wax and coins. The scene where he claims man for his empress, who is Fear, his brother's betrothed. I also found Udanos a very interesting character at the beginning of the book, especially as he is infected with the blood of the Wival, and then the scene with Menendor. The scene with Feather Witch casting the tiles was fascinating. I loved the whole exchange between the Letherii culture, King Discanar, and Hanamosag, representing the Tistador for those harvested seals. I'll get into that later, especially as it represents a lot of the Letherii philosophy there. I laughed so many times throughout this book with the scenes with Tahol and Bug and Shirk. I was fascinated by the character of Serempedic. Another moment that struck me was the moment that Lilac, that demon, placed a hand on Troll's shoulder as he was weeping, as he was sobbing. That was just a powerful image to me. And also just all the scenes with Rulod, really, there were just so many fantastic dramatic moments, fantastic conversations with Rulod and the crippled god. There were also fantastic moments when Rulod goes crazy and then later on softens after exchanges with Udanos and then begs for Fear's forgiveness. I want to talk about that a little bit later too, and of course the whole throne room scene at the end. There were also just so many other elements like the Azath Tower, the child kettle, who I found rather creepy, and the Rat Guild, all these different elements. I also thought the Forkruel Asai, I'm sorry if I'm saying that name wrong, named Serenity in this book, claimed to want peace, but didn't necessarily show that. Same with Calm in House of Chains, and I just find their names interesting too, Calm and Serenity. Anyway, there's so many different things about this book, and of course I'm not going to be able to get into every detail, but I'm going to first talk about the brothers, the Sengars and the Bedics. I want to talk about the differences between those two sets of brothers. I feel like this book really goes into depth about brotherhood, whereas you got a lot of sisterhood with Tavor and Belwison in House of Chains and Deadhouse Gates. I also want to discuss the Letherii culture and this concept of reciprocity as it comes up in the book, as well as the language of debt. I found those concepts absolutely fascinating. But first of all, with the brothers, what was interesting about the Bedics versus the Sengars actually is that in this book, the Bedics are all spread out and on sort of different sides of what's going on, whereas the Sengars are all together the whole entire book, and that kind of ends up working against them. I found that contrast fascinating because the Bedics seem to care about each other. You have Hull Bedict, who had a fascinating backstory. He had worked for the Letherii, and his job was to get to know the different outskirt cultures, like the Narek, and he didn't realize that what he was doing was actually, I don't think he was aware anyway, I got that impression. He was actually working on the side of the Letherii to colonize these cultures and to take over their land. So he was pretty upset about that and wanted to gain vengeance on the Letherii, and decided he would do this by becoming the sword for the Tistador. And then we have Bryce Bedict, and Bryce Bedict was the sword for King Discanar, so he's working with the Letherii there. And then we have Tahol Bedict, and Tahol was an interesting character. He was like this character who's like living his best life, sleeping on roofs, not wearing pants, having his manservant Bug, who turned out to be male, an elder god in the end. I think it'd be interesting to reread this book knowing that Bug is male. What was interesting about Tahol is that when the book starts, it seems like he's pretty indifferent, pretty happy the way things are, when these three women come along and ask him to bring down the Letherii economy since he has these skills. And I just found it interesting that he went along with that, because I didn't understand what his motivation exactly was, but he went along with it in any case, and later on even questioned it because he didn't necessarily think that the Tistador would be better leaders in the end. So again, these three brothers, they're all on different sides of what's going on, and I found that so fascinating, but they all did seem to care about each other. They all had one another's best interest in mind. And then we contrast that with the Sengars, and the Sengar brothers all together all the time, trying to do things for Hannah Mosag, who was a very questionable character, and this whole sword journey, which ends up with Rulad becoming emperor and working for the crippled god. We know going into this book that Troll Sengar is going to be cast out of the Sengars for some reason. We know that something will lead to him being shorn and cast away as he is for House of Chains. But we don't know what that is. I thought we would figure that out in this book, and it wasn't totally clear how that ended up happening. But knowing he would end up being blamed for betraying his brothers or family, I suspected him at the beginning when he was constantly accusing or criticizing Rulad for the way that he was strutting in front of Man. I kind of wondered, not to say that Rulad wasn't doing that and that Man wasn't being a little bit questionable in those scenes, but I happen to wonder if maybe Troll was projecting a little bit and maybe he had the crush on Man, and that maybe those two would end up having something going on later that would lead to things escalating. I was wrong, but it did cross my mind, especially as triggered as he got about Rulad, and Fear, on the other hand, not being as triggered. So I wondered again if maybe Troll was projecting a bit. Fear was an interesting character. Although he lived up to his name, being Fear at the end, turning out to be kind of a coward, I thought it was interesting that he actually seemed to question Hanan Mosag towards the beginning of the book. And then later on, he just went along with whatever Rulad wanted once Rulad became emperor. And it was just heartbreaking, especially the scene when Rulad asked Fear for forgiveness. Oh, that scene was just heartbreaking. I just felt as though Fear was just trying to hold it together at the end. And of course, he couldn't hold it together at the end. He didn't know how to be in that situation. Rulad was just fascinating. One of the scenes that made me gasp the most was when Rulad demanded that Fear hand over Man, his betrothed. There's a line in which Troll says, "Tall, regal, the young woman strode forward as if this moment had been rehearsed 1,000 times. But that is not possible." Why is that? Why is it that she strode forward as if this moment had been rehearsed 1,000 times? And then he says, "But that is not possible." When I read that, I thought, oh wow, I'm just imagining this woman just walking forward and claiming her throne, almost as though she just expected it all along, like she was born for this role kind of thing. And once I read on though, and it says she walked past Fear without a glance and came to stand outward on the left side of the chair. Rulad's hand reached out with a gesture of smug familiarity, and she clasped it. What is with this familiarity? Why is this so familiar? Why does it seem like this has happened before? I was convinced at that point that Man wanted it, because wouldn't she resist it if she didn't want it? Wouldn't she have some resistance if she didn't feel comfortable or didn't want to accept this demand? But instead, as she moves forward, she doesn't even look at Fear. Troll goes on to say that there is horror writ there on Man's face and eyes that she could not disguise and that everybody else could see. And he was basically trying to say in his mind to Fear, "Look, brother, she did not seek this betrayal. Look." I'm going to read the following paragraph to add more context. "It saved them all, salvation to the desperate. She showed them that some truths could not be broken, that even this insane thing on its throne could not crush the visceral honor remaining to the Tistador, and in her face was yet another promise. She could withstand his crimes because there was no choice, a promise that was also a lesson to everyone present. Withstand, suffer, live as you must now live. There will one day be answer to this." I suppose that what's happening here from Troll's perspective is that Man is going towards Rulad. She can't deny him. She has to withstand his crimes. She doesn't have a choice. She's also trying to show herself as an example to her people, not going to deny the honor to the Tistador, But there's also, of course, this idea that there will one day be answer to this. I think that maybe ties together why she acted so familiar, but I still found the word choice interesting and the way that Trull reacted to it initially interesting. Maybe this is Trull coming around to understand Man and what Man's intention is in that action. Man was a very tortured character in general. The bedroom scene was pretty hard to swallow that Featherwitch and Udanos witnessed. There was some question there about whether it was okay that Man received pleasure from that exchange. And then later on, her just spiraling out of control and beating up Featherwitch, just taking out everything on Featherwitch, her slave. It was very heartbreaking to see that cycle of abuse. Now I'm going to discuss the Letherii culture and this whole concept of the language of debt and reciprocity being for fools. This is a quote that I'm taking actually from Trull's perspective, but it was perfect to summarize the worldview that the Letherii culture abided by. And this paragraph, I'm sure it's a famous paragraph. I wouldn't be surprised if it is in any way. But this is a paragraph that begins with Trull Sengar saw chains upon the Letherii, which already is a very fascinating sentence in itself, and chains are a powerful symbol in Malazan. But I'm going to scroll down to later on in the paragraph where it says, progress was necessity, growth was gain. Reciprocity belonged to fools, and debt was the binding force of all nature, of every people and every civilization. Debt was its own language, within which were words used like negotiation, compensation, and justification, and legality was a skein of duplicity that blinded the eyes of justice. An empty throne atop a mountain of golden coins. This was just the perfect paragraph to summarize the way that the Letherii viewed the world, and this comes up quite a few times in the book in other conversation or in other passages. There's actually a passage with Gerun Eberict and Serempedak, in which Gerun Eberict is telling Serempedak that this is an all-consuming way of life, that it consumes all creatures, that this is just natural law. And this view of things is illustrated by these harvested seals on these ships, which appear at the beginning of the book. And Trull is witnessing these ships with these illegally harvested seals, tusked seals, that go underwater, that are taken down by this sea demon. And of course, the Hana Mosag is behind this, but no spears were used to have to kill these Letherii people. But then later on, and you see this through Serempedic's eyes or perspective, she talks about how this was all kind of a sleight of hand, that this was just a big scheme on the Letherei's part, that they could afford those losses, that they just sent those people out there to die, knowing that they were doing this as a way to win political dividends, and in this case land, which is nothing new for the Letherii culture. They've done this before. And so, and of course this is the case when King Discanar goes to see the Tistador, and he meets to discuss this matter with Hana Mosag. Well, Rulad first, and then Rulad hands this over to Hana Mosag. King Discanar is basically saying, yes, there were illegally harvested seals, and you owe us now, and you can pay us back by giving us land. Oh, don't worry, you can fish on that land when you want to. Of course, we can give you permission to do that. Something like that. I think it's like the land of trade or something like that. Hana Mosag was a step ahead, saying, yeah, there were ships, and there were no seals on those ships, so we don't owe you anything. Later on, it seems, through, of course, that conversation with Gerun Eberict to Serempedak, that they don't really see that as a huge loss, even though they didn't quite win in that whole sleight of hand deal. They see it as, this is the law, this is natural law, this is the way that Letherii are always going to win. And of course they have things like very powerful mages on their side and things like that when the battle comes up later on. But this whole idea that this is just the way of things, it really got me to reflect on, of course, capitalism. Everything's about numbers and being measured in the Letherii culture. And you see that reflected not only through Trull's perspective of them there, but also through different characters like Serempedic, definitely through Serempedic's perspective, as well as Udanos. And this idea, though, that reciprocity is for fools, that's a very interesting word choice I noticed come up later on between Hallbedict and Udanos, the slave, in which Udanos at that point is befriending Rulad, which is an incredible notion to Rulad because Rulad is just suffering so much. There's a fantastic conversation that he has with the crippled god about that. He got everything that he thought he had wanted. He got Man, he got his brothers to do what he wanted. He got to be emperor. All these like egotistical ideals that he had set out for himself. He won them all, but he didn't win them all. He didn't earn them. That's his word for it. He didn't earn it, so he was suffering because he didn't earn it. I just found the passage. It says here, "It's not mine though, is it? It is all I can do to hold on. The skill does not belong to me, and all can see that. I have earned nothing." So he knows that everything is about this sword, and it really isn't something that he achieved through his own merit. So in a way, I don't think that the Tistador are really that different than the Letherii. I mean, the Letherii are a little bit more about the scheming and creating these like political plots, obviously trying to colonize and exploit cultures. They definitely go way further than the Tistador as far as that's concerned. But at the same time, just this idea of measuring oneself, and like what the crippled god said, that you mortals baffle me, it's a fool's curse to measure oneself in endless dissatisfaction. I feel like there's a great question here about, is this measurement, this constant need to measure oneself, is there any way beyond that? Is there a way of seeing beyond that? Something that made me think about this topic outside of the books, of course, we live in a capitalist society, and there is so much emphasis on measuring oneself and one's value through progress and gain, and those things that the Letherii culture worship. And again, it's in behaviors. It's not just it's not just the money. It's embedded in identity. I think that's reflected in some of Udanos's passages as well. And this idea that reciprocity is for fools, the idea that you can actually give without expectation, which is something that he tells Halbedict later on in the book. It's something we even see in our culture, like even on BookTube, as innocent a thing as BookTube is, and as much as we are here because we love books, and it's sharing what you love, and it's a hobby, and it's wonderful, there's a collaborative element to it. There's definitely, I think, a sense of reciprocity embedded in at times in BookTube culture. But there's also this idea of measurement and gain. I just celebrated 500 subscribers, so I'm not totally immune to that. Of course, that's a number that one could measure me by in some sense, and I'm not proud of that, but it's there. You have people who do videos on stats and numbers, and we're a society of numbers, that's what I'm saying. And so even when you look at research and stats, those are all numbers. It also made me wonder about other cultures. I know that my husband said that he recently learned something about the Dalai Lama. I don't know if it was directly from the Dalai Lama or somebody else who was referring to the Dalai Lama, who was talking about how Westerners look at the concept of enlightenment. Like it's something that a lot of Westerners who seek enlightenment, they'll beat themselves up for not becoming enlightened, and that's not something that you see in other cultures. That enlightenment's not a journey about like measuring oneself against this task or this ideal goal. So it does make me wonder if this is a Western ideal that we're seeking. I think that the idea is that there's a way to balance this aspect, which is through reciprocity. And the idea of reciprocity, to give without expectation, I think that's an important concept to explore in this book, and an important concept that comes up when Udanos decides to give freely to Rulad. Now, how much agency Udanos has in this book is questionable to me, given how he's infected with the Wival's blood, but it was very profound. Just the scene in which he offers himself to Rulad. He offers just friendship to Rulad. I love the part where they talk about inconsequential conversation. Like that's something that friends can do, is have inconsequential conversation. And I think he talks about like eating eels or something like that. Something that's meaningless in the sense that it's not about trying to gain something from the other. It's not about measurement and gain and progress. It's just about sharing for the sake of sharing. So I appreciated that about this book so much. I also appreciated how colonization was dealt with in this book, and it was so heartbreaking through the character of Halbedict, who of course worked for these different tribes or cultures before the book began, only to see them get exploited. And it was heartbreaking at the end how he was running towards his brother getting beat up when the Narek turned on him and killed him because he didn't have forgiveness in his heart. That was such a heartbreaking scene, and it happened so quickly. I think it happened quickly for me anyway, because there was a lot going on in the book at that time. I found that all the more heartbreaking, especially the more and more I thought about it. Again, I know this doesn't even scratch the surface on this book. I didn't talk about much about the Azath Tower or about the names being passed on through Bryce Benedict and the throne room scene, which was so intense. There's so many powerful, powerful moments in this book. But I thought it would be good to just reflect on a couple of those passages. And again, I want to do a separate video about Serempedek because I really appreciated the way her character explored trauma. So I will provide a separate video for that. And I wanted to end this video with a quote by Bug, which I loved. It was his advice to Dehol. And the quote is, "Make no assumptions about anything, ever. Stay mindful, my friend, and suspicious. Suspicious, but not frightened by complexity." I think that's like the perfect quote when it comes to approaching Malazan. In any case, thank you so much for watching this video, and please feel free to share your thoughts on anything I've shared. I love hearing from you. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.